Meeting to order, everybody. So we'll just, if we could ask you to take your places, that would be much appreciated right now. Thank you. So we're just calling the meeting, the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, meeting 152. Today in Ottawa, the International Grand Committee on Big Data, Privacy and Democracy. I'm just going to go over the countries quickly. We're not going to go through introductions because it would take up too much time, unfortunately. So we have the United Kingdom. With me today, Damien Collins, the co-chair of the International Grand Committee. He'll make comments briefly in a few minutes. We have the Parliament of Singapore with us. The Houses of Ireland are here. The Parliament of the Federal Republic of Germany is with us. The Chamber of Deputies of the Republic of Chile is with us. The Parliament of the Republic of Estonia. The Senate of the United Mexican States, or Mexico, is with us. The House of Representatives of the Kingdom of Morocco are with us, the National Assembly of the Republic of Ecuador, the Legislative Assembly of the Republic of Costa Rica, and the House Assembly of St. Lucia are with us. So I just wanted to introduce my co-chair, Mr. Damien Collins. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you here in Ottawa. It's great to see that since the first meeting of the Grand Committee in London in November that we have new members of the committee here today, additional countries represented, more countries represented. I think it just shows how these issues are only growing in significance, and I'm sure today's discussions will add greatly to that debate.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Collins. And maybe we'll just get translation. I have English on my translation, but I'm getting Spanish, so maybe we want to fix that in the translation booth. What's that? No, I can understand a few words, but can we just try it again? So we should have English on. Everybody good? We're good to go. Okay, so we'll start off with our witnesses this morning. As individuals, Mr. Jim Balsillie, Chair of the Center of International Governance Innovation. Mr. Roger McNamee, author of Zucked. Shoshana Zuboff, the author of Surveillance Capitalism. And last but certainly not least, from Manila in the Philippines, Maria Reza, the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director of Rappler Incorporated. Today we'll start off with our very own Jim Balsillie. Go ahead.
Co-chairs Zimmer and Collins, committee members, it's my honor and privilege to testify today. Data governance is the most important public policy issue of our time. It is cross-cutting with economic, social, and security dimensions. It requires both national policy frameworks and international coordination. Over the past 3 years, Mr. Zimmer, Angus, and Erskine Smith spearheaded a Canadian bipartisan effort to deal with data governance. I'm inspired by the seriousness and integrity they bring to the task. My perspective is that of a capitalist and global tech entrepreneur for 30 years and counting. I'm the retired chairman and co-CEO of Research in Motion, a Canadian technology company we scaled from an idea to $20 billion in sales. While most are familiar with the iconic BlackBerry smartphone, ours was actually a platform business that connected tens of millions of users to thousands of consumer and enterprise applications via some 600 cellular carriers in over 150 countries. We understood how to leverage Metcalfe's law of network effects to create a category-defining company. So I'm deeply familiar with multi-sided platform business model strategies, as well as navigating the interface between business and public policy. I'll start with several observations about the nature, scale, and breadth of our collective challenge here. Disinformation and fake news are just two of the many negative outcomes from unregulated, attention-based business models. They cannot be addressed in isolation. They have to be tackled horizontally as part of an integrated whole. To agonize over social media's role in proliferation of online hate, conspiracy theories, politically motivated misinformation, and harassment is to miss the root and scale of the problem. Second, social media's toxicity is not a bug, it's a feature. Technology works exactly as designed. Technology products, services, and networks are not built in a vacuum. Usage patterns drive product development decisions. Behavioral scientists involved with today's platforms help design user experiences that capitalize on negative reactions because they produce far more engagement than positive reactions. Third, among the many valuable insights provided by whistleblowers inside the tech industry is this quote: The dynamics of the attention economy are structurally set up to undermine the human will. End of quote. Democracy and markets work when people can make choices aligned with their interests. The online advertisement-driven business model subverts choice and represents a foundational threat to markets, election integrity, and democracy itself. Fourth, technology gets its power through control of data. Data at the micro-personal level gives technology unprecedented power to influence. Data is not the new oil, it's the new plutonium. Amazingly powerful, dangerous when it spreads, difficult to clean up, and with serious consequences when improperly used. Data deployed through next-generation 5G networks is transforming passive infrastructure into veritable digital nervous systems. Our current domestic and global institutions, rules, and regulatory frameworks are not designed to deal with any of these emerging challenges. Because cyberspace knows no natural borders, digital transformation's effects cannot be hermetically sealed within national boundaries. International coordination is critical. With these observations in mind, here are my 6 recommendations for your consideration. 1. Eliminate tax deductibility of specific categories of online ads. 2. Ban personalized online advertising for elections. 3. Implement strict data governance regulations for political parties. 4. Provide effective whistleblower protections. 5. Add explicit personal liability alongside corporate responsibility to affect CEO and board of director decision-making. And 6. Create a new institution for like-minded nations to address digital cooperation and stability. Technology is disrupting governance, and if left unchecked, could render liberal democracy obsolete. By displacing the print and broadcast media and influencing public opinion, technology is becoming the new fourth estate. In our system of checks and balances, this makes technology co-equal with the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. When this new fourth estate declines to appear before this committee, as Silicon Valley executives are currently doing, it is symbolically asserting this aspirational co-equal status. But is asserting this status and claiming its privileges without the traditions, disciplines, legitimacy, or transparency that check the power of the traditional fourth estate. The work of this International Grand Committee is a vital first step towards redress of this untenable current situation. And as Professor Zuboff said last night, we Canadians are currently in an historic battle for the future of our democracy with a charade called Sidewalk Toronto. I'm here to tell you that we will win that battle. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bilsilly. Next up for 5 minutes, we'll go to Mr. McNamee.
Co-chairs Zimmer and Collins, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to address you today. My remarks will build on last night's presentations by Professor Zuboff, Professor Twark, Ben Scott, and today's by Jim. For the 35 years I spent as an investor, I shared Silicon Valley's commitment to technology that empowers the people who use it. Beginning in 2004, however, I noticed a transformation in the culture of Silicon Valley. And over the course of a decade, customer-focused models were replaced by the relentless pursuit of global scale, monopoly, and massive wealth. As Professor Zuboff told you, Google was the first to see the economic opportunity from converting all human experience into data. Google wants to make the world more efficient. They want to eliminate user stress that results from too many choices. Now, Google knew that society would not permit a business model based on denying consumer choice and free will, so they covered their tracks. Beginning around 2012, Facebook adopted a similar strategy, later followed by Amazon, Microsoft, and others. For Google and Facebook, the business is behavioral prediction. They build a high-resolution data avatar of every consumer, a voodoo doll, if you will. They gather a tiny amount of data from user posts and queries, but the vast majority of their data comes from surveillance, web tracking, scanning emails and documents, data from apps and third parties, and ambient surveillance from products like Alexa, Google Assistant, Sidewalk Labs, and Pokemon Go. Google and Facebook use data voodoo dolls to provide their customers, who are marketers, with perfect information about every consumer. They use the same data to manipulate consumer choices. Just as in China, behavioral manipulation is the goal. The algorithms of Google and Facebook are tuned to keep users on site and active, preferably by pressing emotional buttons that reveal each user's true self. For most users, this means content that provokes fear or outrage. Hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories are catnip for these algorithms. The design of these platforms treats all content precisely the same, whether it be hard news from a reliable site, a warning about an emergency, or a conspiracy theory. The platforms make no judgments. Users choose, aided by algorithms that reinforce past behavior. The result is 2.5 billion Truman Shows on Facebook, each a unique world with its own facts. In the U.S., nearly 40% of the population identifies with at least one thing that is demonstrably false. This undermines democracy. The people at Google and Facebook are not evil. They are products of an American business culture with few rules, where misbehavior seldom results in punishment. Smart people take what they can get and tell themselves they earned it. They feel entitled. Consequences are someone else's problem. Unlike industrial businesses, internet platforms are highly adaptable, and this is the challenge. If you take away one opportunity, they will move on to the next one, and they are moving up market, getting rid of the middlemen. Today, they apply behavioral prediction to advertising, but they have already set their sights on transportation and financial services. This is not an argument against undermining their advertising business, but rather a warning that it may be a Pyrrhic victory. If your goals are to protect democracy and personal liberty, you have to be bold. You have to force a radical transformation of the business model of internet platforms. That would mean, at a minimum, banning web tracking, scanning of email and documents, third-party commerce and data, and ambient surveillance. A second option would be to tax micro-targeted advertising to make it economically unattractive. But you also need to create space for alternative business models using antitrust law. Startups can happen anywhere. They can come from each of your countries. At the end of the day, though, the most effective path to reform would be to shut down the platforms, at least temporarily, as Sri Lanka did. Any country can go first. The platforms have left you no choice. The time has come to call their bluff. Companies with responsible business models will emerge overnight to fill the void. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McNamee. Next up, we'll go to Ms. Zuboff.
I'm sorry?
Thank you, Mr. McNamee. We'll go next to Ms. Zuboff.
Thank you. Thank you, Co-Chairman Zimmer, Co-Chairman Collins. It's such a pleasure to be here today. As you know, I'm hail from the Harvard Business School, where I am Professor Emerita, but more importantly, the author of this book on surveillance capitalism. And I say that because I want you to know that any statements and conclusions that I reach today are amply supported by the information and analysis in that work. And I might add that my scholarly work on the digital future began in the year 1978. So I'll let you do the math on that. My remarks this morning cover some highlights of a longer written statement, which I have submitted to the committee, and I add for the record that I am deeply committed to the work of this very important group, and that includes continuing to support your work in any way I can, offline, in future meetings. and as we engage this world historic challenge. The internet is now an essential medium of social participation, and it is owned and operated by private surveillance capital. The questions of law and regulation that this committee seeks to explore cannot be answered without a clear grasp of surveillance capitalism as a novel economic logic defined by distinct economic imperatives that compel specific practices. I don't want to repeat everything that I talked about last night, and Roger has touched on some of the key issues, as has Jim. So I'm going to skip ahead to the idea of economic imperatives. What we see in surveillance capitalism, the unilateral claiming of private human experience, its translation into behavioral data, their fabrication into prediction products, which are sold in a new kind of marketplace that trades exclusively in human futures. When we deconstruct the competitive dynamics of these markets, we get to understand what the new imperatives are. First of all, scale. They need a lot of data in order to make good predictions, economies of scale. Secondly, scope. They need varieties of data to make good predictions. Ultimately, in a third phase of this competitive struggle, it was discovered that the most predictive data comes from actually intervening in human behavior, intervening in the state of play, in order to have predictions that come closer and closer to actual observations, so that they can guarantee outcomes to their business customers. That is how you win in human futures markets. All right. I'll just share with you one brief quote from a data scientist that rings in everybody's ears when they hear it. He said to me, "We can engineer the context around a particular behavior and force change that way. We are learning how to write the music, and then we let the music make them dance." Friends, this is behavioral modification, systemically institutionalized on a global scale, mediated by a now ubiquitous digital infrastructure. It began online. It traveled offline into the real world on our telephones, our cell phones. Ultimately, now we live in a world of devices that allows this to be amplified and perpetuated. This digital architecture is growing every day. I call it the big other. And it is at this new level of competitive intensity that it is no longer enough to automate information flows about us. The goal now is to automate us. The goal is to automate us not only as individuals, not only as small groups, but increasingly on the scale of populations. The goal is to have surveillance capitalism's computational analysis, which favors its own commercial outcomes, replace democracy and governance as we know it. In fact, at this very moment in the city of Toronto, Alphabet-owned Sidewalk Labs is spinning its own new euphemisms, which it calls, quote, governance innovation. This is Orwellian code for the deconstruction of local democracy in favor of Sidewalk's computational rule, which is in the final analysis a reincarnation of a kind of absolutist tyranny that we thought we had left behind us in the 18th century, now served with cappuccino and draped in ones and zeros. Surveillance capitalism assaults democracy from below and from above. From below, it is a direct assault on human autonomy and agency, essential for the possibility of a democratic society. From above, it is marked by asymmetries of knowledge and power, the likes of which human history has never seen. I want to move on to the question of what is to be done, because this is what we really didn't have time to discuss very much last night, and building on Jim's excellent recommendations, all of which I agree with. Surveillance capitalism has thrived in the absence of law, as we all know. I take that as a positive sign, because what this means is that we have not failed to rein in this rogue mutation of capitalism. The real issue is we haven't really tried. The accompanying good news is that our societies have experience reining in the raw excesses of a destructive capitalism. We did it to end the Gilded Age. We did it to mitigate the Great Depression. We did it in the post-war era. We did it in the 70s to save creatures, air, water, workers, consumers. We know how to do this. This is what democracy is for. It is time to do it again. The great business historian Tom McCraw wrote a brilliant history of regulation in the 20th century, the 19th and 20th century. He identified several phases of regulatory regimes. Starting in the late 19th century, the muckrakers. Moving into the early 20th century, the progressives. Later in the New Deal in the early 1970s, the regulatory frameworks were run by legal minds, legal scholars, and legal experts. Finally, by the late 1970s, the 80s, and right down to today, it's the economists who have held sway. But this has been a changing dynamic. And what he notes is that at the end of the day, when you look at the more than a century of regulatory issues, regulatory frameworks, the emphasis has come down on fairness and justice over narrow considerations of economic growth. And McCraw asks the question, he says, the economist's hour will not last. What is it that will come next? I want to tell you what it is that will come next. The next great regulatory vision will be framed and implemented by you and by us. It will be elected officials, citizens, and specialists, allied in the knowledge that despite its failures and shortcomings, democracy is the one idea to emerge from the long human story that enshrines the people's right to self-governance and asserts the ideal of the sovereign individual that is the single most powerful bulwark against tyranny. We give up these ideas at our peril, but only democracy can impose the people's interest through law and regulation. McCraw also warns that regulators have failed when they did not adequately frame strategies appropriate to the particular industries that they were regulating. So the question is, what kind of law and regulation today will be 21st century solutions aimed at the unique 21st century complexities of surveillance capitalism? There are three arenas in which legislative and regulatory strategies can effectively align with the structure and consequences of surveillance capitalism. Briefly, first, we need lawmakers to devise strategies that interrupt and in many cases outlaw surveillance capitalism's foundational mechanisms. This includes the unilateral taking of private human experience as a free source of raw material and its translation into data. It includes the extreme information asymmetries necessary for predicting human behavior. It includes the manufacture of computational prediction products based on the unilateral and secret capture of human experience. It includes the operation of prediction markets that trade in human futures. Second, from the point of view of supply and demand, surveillance capitalism can be understood as a market failure. Every piece of research over the last decades has shown that when users are informed of the backstage operations of surveillance capitalism, they want no part of it. They want protection. They reject it. They want alternatives. We need laws and regulatory frameworks designed to advantage companies that want to break with the surveillance capitalist paradigm. Forging an alternative trajectory to the digital future will require alliances of new competitors who can summon and institutionalize an alternative ecosystem. True competitors that align themselves with the actual needs of people and the norms of market democracy are likely to attract just about every person on earth as their customers. Third, lawmakers will need to support new forms of citizen action, collective action. Just as nearly a century ago, workers won legal protection for their rights to organize, to bargain, and to strike. New forms of citizen solidarity are already emerging in municipalities that seek an alternative to the Google-owned smart city future, in communities that want to resist the social costs of so-called disruption imposed for the sake of others' gain, and among workers who seek fair wages and reasonable security in the precarious conditions of the so-called gig economy. Citizens need your help, but you need citizens, because ultimately they will be the wind behind your wings. They will be the sea change in public opinion and public awareness that supports your political initiatives. If together we aim to shift the trajectory of the digital future back toward its emancipatory promise, we resurrect the possibility that the future can be a place that all of us might call home. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zuboff, for that testimony. We'll go next to Ms. Reza for 10 minutes.
Sorry. Okay. Co-Chairman Zimmer, Collins, it's been, I'm still in the same clothes. Good evening from Manila. As I said early in our morning, your night last night, the Philippines, we here are a cautionary tale for you. An example of how quickly democracy crumbles, is eroded from within, and how these information operations can take over the entire ecosystem and transform lies into facts. If you can make people believe lies are facts, then you can control them. Without facts, you don't have truth. Without truth, you don't have trust. Journalists have long been the gatekeepers for facts. When we come under attack, democracy is under attack. When this situation happens, the voice with the loudest megaphone wins. The Philippines is a petri dish for social media. As of January 2019, We Are Social, or Hootsuite, has said that Filipinos spend the most time online and the most time on social media globally. Facebook is our internet, but as I'll show you with some of the data, you should get them handed to you. This is about introducing a virus into our information ecosystem. Over time, that virus, lies masquerading as facts, that virus takes over the body politic, and you need to develop a vaccine. That's what we're in search of, and I think we do see a solution. I've been a journalist for more than 30 years. My book, published in 2011, From Bin Laden to Facebook, looked at how the transformation, how this virulent ideology of terrorism moved from the physical world to the virtual world, and how the Al-Qaeda link group, the Abu Sayyaf here in the Philippines, actually in 2011 used YouTube to try to negotiate ransom for the people it kidnapped. I first began looking at social networks in this spread of the virulent ideology, and while writing the book, that was when I stumbled on the strategy for Rappler, the startup that we've created in 2012. Using social media and journalism, we embraced it. I drank the Kool-Aid. We built communities of action in a country with weak institutions and endemic corruption. If social networks are your family and friends in the physical world, social media is your family and friends on steroids, no boundaries of time and space, right? So understanding information cascades was essential to the growth of Rappler. We were alpha partners of Facebook. We believed and made real social media for social change. And we grew 100% to 300% year on year from the time we were founded in 2012 to 2015. And then, like the rest of the world, 2016 happened. In May of 2016, President Duterte was elected. A month later is Brexit, so on and so on. That was a tipping point for the information operations in our systems. In the Philippines, the weaponization of social media began in July 2016, after President Duterte won, not coincidentally, when our brutal drug war began. In a global study with 12 other research groups, we helped define patriotic trolling, online, state-sponsored hate meant to pound you to silence, to incite hate against the target, to stifle dissent or criticism. One of the first targets of attack were journalists and news groups. I'm going to quickly show you here the astroturfing that's typical of a three-pronged attack of a target in the Philippines. You know, the first step is to allege corruption. Doesn't matter, doesn't have to be true, just allege it. If you do it exponentially, it becomes truth. A lie told 1,000,000 times is truth. Step two, a woman, if you're a female, you will get attacked sexually. Step three, lay the groundwork for what you want to happen, whatever that policy is. In this case, the propaganda machine tried to trend, if you can zoom in here, hopefully you'll get this, but they tried to trend hashtag arrest Maria Ressa, right? So from here, it went on to jump from the government's creator, the blogger, to a Twitter account that was used in the campaign. So whatever was used in the campaigns then became weaponized. In Tagalog, it says, ipatawag na yan, call her to the Senate, hashtag arrest Maria Ressa. Then it moves to, I can smell an arrest and possible closure of Rapper.com. Then finally it moves to the sexual attacks. Maybe Maria Ressa's dream is to become the ultimate porn star in a gangbang scene. It is not. And then finally, this is a real person who just graduated college. Me to the RP government, make sure Maria Ressa gets publicly raped to death when martial law expands to Luzon. It would bring joy in my heart. Hashtag arrest Maria Ressa was an attempt to trend this, to astroturf. This was in May of 2017. My first arrest was in February of 2019. When I was arrested, the methodology is all too familiar. You astroturf on social media, you jump laterally to co-opted traditional media, then repeat and pound top down. In the case of the attack against me and Rappler, it came from President Duterte himself during his State of the Nation address in July of 2017. Social media in 2016 began to lay down the foundation of the legal cases that were filed against us. Starting January 2018, the government filed 11 cases and investigations against me and Rappler in a 14-month period. That's roughly a case a month, right? In about 3 months, I posted bail 8 times. In a 5-week period, I was arrested twice, detained once, and my only crime is to be a journalist, to speak truth to power, to defend the press freedom that's guaranteed under our Constitution. Here's how it happened. Let me show you. Please, in this one, can you zoom in? And again, I'll make sure you already have a copy of this. Let's see if he can zoom in. This is a database that we actually began to put together as a defense. Since we lived on social media, we were able to identify the attacks early on. We found a sock puppet network of 26 fake accounts. As journalists, we then did due diligence to make sure it was fake. And then we went and counted manually. How many accounts could it impact? From 26 fake accounts, they could impact as many as 3 million. That became the basis of this database, and this is over time, January 2015, all the way to April 2017, right? And you can't see it, it's 2. But you can basically see the same thing that's happened in the West, which is a fracture line of society. You can see this here. And then after the drug war began, it was pounded, literally pounded 1,000,000 times, and it becomes fact, it becomes a solid line. After this, bayaran, it translates to corrupt, was pounded so frequently that it had 1.7 million comments in a one-month period. This one is the last. I want to just show you the database and the very crude UX that we built for our social media team, because it shows you how the ecosystem, the information ecosystem, is interrelated. On this one, this shows you the URLs that are controlled, well, can be by Google, by YouTube. In the middle round here, you'll see the Facebook pages that actually spread that URL. And then here you'll see the average reposting time. What we did for our team so that they can find the difference between information operations and a real person is to actually show, after we published the propaganda series in in October of 2016, you can see when it's red, that means it's been reposted more than 10 times. We zoomed in on one account, and then you can see again, you will have this presentation. You can see that this is actually just the same post reposted over and over and over again, not just on websites, but also on Facebook pages that were used in the campaign, not just of President Duterte, but also of Vice Presidential candidate Bongbong Marcos. So what do? Well, here's the last thing I do want to show you. This is data that when you look at it this way, actually doesn't show you much. It's just a list of Facebook pages and then the weighted degree, in degree, out degree, and then a weighted degree. But if you put it together, you will see this network. And again, this will be handed to you, but this is the social network that was behind the attack on our Vice President, Leni Robredo, in 2017. And I say this because it was so organized and it has been sustained. We're talking about almost 3 years that we've lived through this, that the content creators are broken down by demographic. This account takes care, this is where the attack began. This account takes care of kind of the pseudo-intellectual, the supposed thinking class. The middle class content creator is this account, and then this is the mass base account, right? From there it jumps to traditional media, but the co-opted, this one is a newspaper that is essentially, the chairman emeritus is the man in charge of international public relations for President Duterte. From there, it connects with state media, and then you close the link on this entire group. By the way, at that point in time, in 2017, Philippines and Russia inked a partnership, and we actually had state media employees in Sputnik's offices. And finally, you close it by taking that mass-based account and appointing her to head social media for the presidential palace. It's an incredible ecosystem. Where does it go, and what can we do about it? Well, in the long term, it's education, and you've heard from our other three witnesses before me exactly some of the things that can be done. In the medium term, yes, media literacy, but in the short term, frankly, it's only the social media platforms that can do something immediately. And we're on the front lines. We need immediate help and immediate solution. Rappler is one of 3 fact-checking partners of Facebook in the Philippines, and we do take that responsibility seriously. We don't look at the content alone. Once we check to make sure that it is a lie, we look at the network that spreads the lies. The first step is to stop new virus from entering the ecosystem. It is whack-a-mole if you only look at the content, but when you begin to look at the networks that spread it, then you have something that you can pull out.
Mr. Reza, if we could just have you close off your testimony. We're at 12 minutes, so I'd like to get to questions if we could.
Sure. So I guess just to end with this is that I don't know unless you've been the subject of an attack. It's very difficult to go through 90 hate messages per hour, sustained over days and months. That is what we're going through, the kind of astroturfing that turns lies into truth. For us, this is a matter of survival.
Yeah. And my apologies for cutting you off. Your testimony is powerful, and we've watched your story from afar, so we'll get to questions. I will have to warn you that we're only going to have enough time for 1 question per delegation this particular round. The next round, we have enough time for everybody. So we're going to start off with Damian Collins. We're going to go to Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, Peter Kent, Mr. Angus, and then go through the delegation. That should give us 5 minutes each. Again, it's going to be tight. I'm going to try and keep us on a 5-minute time. I'm going to say as I possibly can. So we'll start off with Mr. Collins. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's 5 minutes per delegation.
Yes,
Yeah,
correct.
so I'll try and, I've got 2 short questions, so hopefully my colleagues will be able to get in. Roger McNamee, in your book, you said, as far as I can tell, Zuck has always believed that users value privacy more than they should. On that basis, do you think we are going to have to establish in law the standards we want to see enforced in terms of users' rights to data privacy, with independent regulators to oversee them, because the companies will never do that effectively themselves because they just don't share the concerns we have about how the systems are being abused.
Yeah, I believe that is not only correct in terms of their philosophy, as Professor Zuboff points out, it is baked into their business model, this notion that any data that exists in the world, claimed or otherwise, they will claim for their own economic use. And again, framing how you do that privacy, I think, is extremely difficult, and in my opinion, would be best done by simply banning the behaviors that are used to gather the data.
This is a final question for me. You also suggest in your book that the problems in terms of election interference could have started around the time certain advertising tools like lookalike audiences were launched on the platform.
Yes.
I'd be interested if you say anything more about that. And also, do you believe that some of these targeting tools, and as Professor Zuboff sort of suggested as well, some of these targeting tools should be banned from political advertising? So maybe you shouldn't be able to use lookalike audiences, and indeed in the UK, the Information Commissioner has already questioned whether they're legal under GDPR.
So essentially, the problem here is the inversion of politics from the advocacy of a set of policies and convincing people to join you on those policies to an election where the number of campaigns is equal to the number of voters, and you can use the micro-targeting to take these campaigns at the individual level. In the United States, it was used to suppress the vote. I can't speak to exactly how it was done in Brexit, but it's very obvious that there was dramatic effect there. And the essential point here is whether you believe that one can have a healthy democracy in an environment where there is advertising that is completely unaccountable because the only people who see it are the intended recipients.
Thank you. I'll see the rest of my time.
Sure. 2.5 minutes.
I was very interested, Mr. Balsillie, in what you were saying about creating a structure of holding the platforms to account. Do you think that the creation of a liability for platforms empowering citizens to take action for damage caused, like the law of tort, would be a way of holding platforms to account?
One thing I can assure you, that when a board of directors or a CEO has to sign an attestation where they're personally liable, whether it's civil or criminal, I guarantee you that sobers the mind and introduces a form of prudence and conservatism in their behavior. So you introduce that tort construct or criminal, and you get an attestation that they have to sign, and if citizens have the ability to be compensated for that, I assure you that focuses the mind in the corporate boardrooms of tech companies and others, in my experience.
I raised the tort concept because we heard from the broadcasting regulator in the UK last week that she doesn't really consider that a regulator alone has sufficient flexibility or resources to deal with the scale of the challenge. And I wonder if we individualize the accountability through the development of a liability for the platforms, that would be a way to empower citizens to take the action we need.
I think that's. I think you create liability, whether it's through class action or individual, whether it's through regulators. I assure you, whether it's corporate, that's one liability. But if it's personal and it ensnares, and the other thing is that it's one thing to be the CEO that's liable, if you're a board person who says my board fees aren't enough for me to be ensnared in this, that changes behavior. So yeah, you introduce liability and shifts on that. How you specifically create somebody who can apply through the courts and all that is specific to each jurisdiction, but it changes the decision approaches. Yes.
Okay, my question is to Roger McNee, which is, what do you think Mark Zuckerberg is more frightened about, privacy regulation or antitrust action?
I think he's more afraid of privacy. He's more afraid of privacy. And to Mr. Lucas, I would just say the hardest part of this is setting the standard of what the harm is. These guys have hidden behind the fact that it's very hard to quantify many of these things.
Thank you, Ms. Stevens. We'll go to Mr. Erskine-Smith for 5 minutes.
So because Mr. Picard has a copy of Age of Surveillance with sticky notes all over it and highlights, I'll pass my 5 minutes to him.
My question will start with Ms. Zuboff. You talk about someone is writing the music for us to dance on, so let's dance. Your question at the beginning is, can the digital future be our home? My reaction to that was, in fact, the question should be, can the future home be without digital?
Yes, well, I mean, that's such an important distinction because I don't think there's a single one of us in this room that is against the digital per se. This is not about being anti-technology. It's about technology being hijacked by a rogue economic logic that has turned it to its own purposes. So we talked about this a little bit last night, the idea that conflating the digital with surveillance capitalism is a dangerous category error. What we need is to be able to free the potential of the digital, to get back to those values of democratization of knowledge and individual emancipation and empowerment that it was meant to serve and that it still can serve. And
because you mentioned, that's where I thought we were going to go, because you refer in your book that now, compared to the Industrial Revolution, where somewhere, although we were scared of the new technology, this technology was addressed to people for them to be beneficiary of those progress.
Yes.
Now, we're not beneficiary at all. It's like you say, it's a coup de gens. It's not a coup d'état, it's a coup de gens. So it's not a second step of this revolution. It's a situation where people become the producer of the raw material. And as you mentioned, as you write, Google's invention revealed new capabilities to infer and deduce the thoughts, feelings, intention, interests of individuals and groups with an automated architecture that operates as a one-way mirror irrespective of a person's awareness. So like people connected to the machine in Matrix.
well, yes, that metaphor is full of potential. It is true. From the very beginning, the data scientists at Google who were inventing surveillance capitalism celebrated in their written patents and in their research, published research, they celebrated the fact that they could hunt and capture behavioral surplus without users ever being aware of these backstage operations. Surveillance was baked into the DNA of this economic logic, essential to its strange form of value creation. So it's with that kind of sobriety and gravitas that it is called surveillance capitalism, because without the surveillance piece, it cannot exist.
So I'm in a world where I cannot live without digital. Of course, I have two phones just for me, and yes, three. And my phone, my fridge can talk to me now. We learned that a few weeks ago. It's everywhere. Now I have to regulate all this. I have two possibilities. One is if I quote Mr. Schmidt in Mobile World Congress, he said, when asked about government regulation, Schmidt said that technology moves so fast that governments really shouldn't try to regulate it because it will change too fast, and any problem will be solved by technology. We move much faster than any government. Maybe a comment, also Mr. Belsilli, a comment on this, Professor.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because this is part of the relentless ideology of the surveillance capitalists. They have tried to put lawmakers on the run. They have tried to pit lawmakers against citizens, that we serve the citizens. This is exactly what's going on in Toronto right now. Do you really want the government to take away these beautiful wooden buildings and these warm sidewalks that we're going to build for you? So this is ideology. The fact is that they claim the right to freedom in the same way that Adam Smith and Frederick Hayek argued that we need free markets, free market actors, because the marketplace is this ineffable mystery that no one can manage. So ergo, freedom is necessary. The surveillance capitalists claim that freedom, but the market is no longer ineffable for them. They have total information. They know everything that's going into and out of their marketplaces. surveillance capitalism knows too much to qualify for freedom. This is a rotten ideology at its core, and we must not be intimidated by it.
I just have a few seconds, Mr.
Thank
Basile,
you.
on technology
We're out of time,
solutions.
Mr. Picard, so we'll go next up for 5 minutes.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Kent.
And thank you, Chair. Thanks to all of our witnesses this morning. It has been very enlightening. Well, there seems to be general agreement that eventually harmonized legislation, regulation, policy development across the democracies may be a counter to surveillance capitalism. That doesn't seem likely anytime soon. Ms. Zuboff, last night you said the front line in surveillance capitalism is Toronto, in Sidewalk Labs and the Smart City Project. Mr. Balsillie, you've been quoted as saying that Sidewalk Labs is a colonizing experience in surveillance capitalism, and that Sidewalk Labs continues to weaponize ambiguity. To the two of you, I'd like to ask, perhaps Ms. Zuboff first, then Mr. Balsillie, has Waterfront Toronto, has the City of Toronto been steamrollered, bamboozled by Sidewalk Labs' razzle-dazzle, Mr. Doctoroff's vision as it has gradually emerged?
Well, of course, I would see to Mr. Basile because he's been more on the ground there than I have, but talking with the folks there and including Bianca Wiley, who's the citizen activist, and reading everything that I have read, I mean, there's no question. I mean, this is how Sidewalk Labs operates. They go into cities offering things that the municipality itself cannot afford, and they do it for a quid pro quo, the suspension of law. They say, we'll come into your city and we'll provide all of these things, but we don't want to have to deal with policies and we don't want to have to deal with politics. You're going to have to clean all that up if you want our money. So this is the direct bypassing of democracy in order to impose their vision, which ultimately is aimed at their own narrow commercial purposes.
Which was basically what Mr. Schmidt said some years ago, give us a city to run and we'll run it. Mr. Balsillie?
Yeah, history will be very kind to those that are taking the leadership, like around this table, and it will judge very harshly those that succumbed to their personal insecurities, to be razzle-dazzled by these folks. Of course you can regulate. You have all the power to regulate. Of course you can. And I think you can regulate very much in the near term. There are very, very clear surgical points that you can move to that will begin the shift, as everyone has mentioned, certainly, and people are calling for help, like Ms. Reza.
But with regards to, we've seen that Google has said in response to new federal elections legislation on advertising, well, we'll simply withdraw from accepting advertising. Is it possible that big data could simply pull out of jurisdictions where regulations, in the absence of harmonized regulation across the democracies, are present?
Well, that's the best news possible, because as everyone's attested here, the purpose of surveillance capitalism is to undermine personal autonomy. And yet, elections in democracy are centered on the sovereign self, exercise their sovereign will. Now, why in the world would you want to undermine the core bedrock of election in a non-transparent fashion to the highest bidder at the very time your whole citizenry is on the line? And in fact, the revenue for this is immaterial to these companies. So one of my recommendations is just ban personalized online ads during elections. We have a lot of things you're not allowed to do for 6 or 8 weeks. Just put that into the package. It's simple and straightforward.
Mr. McNamee?
There's one point that I think is being overlooked here, which is really important, which is if these companies disappeared tomorrow, the services they offer would not disappear from the marketplace. It would take literally moments. I mean, in a matter of weeks, you could replicate Facebook, which would be the harder one. There are substitutes for everything that Google does that are done without surveillance capitalism. Do not, in your mind, allow any kind of connection between the services you like and the business model of surveillance capitalism. There is no inherent link there, none at all. This is something that has been created by these people because it's wildly more profitable.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Next up, Mr. Angus.
Chair. I'll say at the beginning, I represent a region that's bigger than the United Kingdom. I represent communities that have no roads, some of the poorest indigenous communities. And Facebook and YouTube transformed the power of indigenous communities to speak to each other, to start to change the dynamic of how white society spoke about them. So I understand its incredible power for the good. I see more and more, though, in my region, self-radicalized people who are, it's impossible to speak to them. Flat earthers, yes, there are. I met them. Anti-vaxxers, 9/11 truthers. And I've seen it affect in our elections through the manipulation of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim materials. But I have not yet seen the threat of death. So, Ms. Reza, you said that when in the West, what we face yesterday, I think to be correct, is that we face democratic threats. People are dying in Asia for the manipulation of these platforms. I want to ask you, is there in an act of solidarity with our parliament, with our legislators, if there's statements that should be made publicly through our parliament to give you support so that we can maintain a link with you as an important ally on the front line? I'd like to ask that as my first question.
First, thank you. Prime Minister Trudeau was actually, when he visited Manila, was the only person during, I believe it was APEC, who mentioned human rights at all, of all the world leaders who were here at that point in time. Canada's been at the forefront of holding fast to the values of human rights, of press freedom. So thank you. I mean, in advance, I think the more we speak about this, then the more the values are reiterated, especially since someone like President Trump truly likes President Duterte and vice versa. It's very personal. But, sir, when you talked about, where people are dying, you've seen this all over Asia. There's Myanmar, there is the drug war here in the Philippines, India and Pakistan, just instances when this tool for empowerment, just like in your district, it is something that we do not want to go away, not shut down. And despite the great threats that we face, that I face and my company faces, Facebook, the social media platforms still give us the ability to organize, to create communities of action that have not been there before.
Thank you very much. I've been very concerned about Sidewalk Labs, and I'm looking at it as a real estate deal. This may be the most prime real estate in North America that was handed over to Google on what the Auditor General of Ontario said was the shortest RFP she's ever seen. I think 6 weeks. It's 10 weeks for a local art project down there. Dan Doktorov came and told us it was the longest RFP in history. The Auditor General raised concerns that there was no public involvement, that this was done behind the scenes. Dan Doktorov told us that this was the most open process ever. I'm very concerned about the privatization of public space. I come from mining country. We had company towns. We fought like hell to get rid of them. I've heard from Mr. Basili. I've heard from Ms. Zuboff. Mr. McNamee, what do you think the citizens of Toronto should do regarding giving Google that prime real estate in the downtown where so many people gather?
I wouldn't let them within 100 miles of Toronto. So the fundamental issue here is one of self-governance and self-determination. And so I just don't believe any business, not Google, not anybody, should be in the business of operating our public spaces and our civic infrastructure. I just think that, there's a limit to what you can do with a public-private partnership, and that is way over the line. There's an experiment going on, I believe, in Barcelona, where there is a smart city project going on where the community and the citizens own the data. That'll be a very interesting thing to watch. The observation I would make is I am still cautious about the gathering of the data in the first place. Okay. I believe that the underlying issues relative to surveillance create too many temptations for people, And at the moment, it's way, way, way too difficult to monitor what they're doing with the data once it's collected. So I believe that all of these things require, to use the old government thing, it requires dramatically more study before we move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. We'll get into our delegations. So next up, we'll go to the Parliament of Singapore for 5 minutes.
Question for Mr. McNamee. Thank you very much to all of you for your presentation this morning. So you made the point that the business model of these platforms really is focused on algorithms that drive content to people who think they want to see this content. And you also mentioned that fear, outrage, hate speech, conspiracy theories is what sells more. And I assume what you mean to say by that is it sells more than truths. Would that be right?
So there was a study done at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that suggested that disinformation spreads 70% further and 6 times faster than fact.
Yes.
And there are actually good human explanations for why hate speech and conspiracy theories move so rapidly. It's about triggering the flight or fight reflex.
Yes. And when you throw in what Ms. Ressa said earlier about how disinformation is spread through the use of bots, I think she said 26 fake accounts translating to 3 million different accounts which spread the information. I think we are facing a situation where disinformation, if not properly checked, gets exponentially viral. People get to see it all the time. And over time, unchecked, this leads to a serious erosion of trust, serious undermining of institutions. We can't trust elections, and fundamentally, democracy becomes marginalized and eventually demolished. Would that be a right way of
I agree with
assessing
that. I agree with that statement completely. To me, the challenge is in how you manage it. So if you think about the censorship and moderation, were never designed to handle things at the scale that these internet platforms operate at. So in my view, the better strategy is to do the interdiction upstream, to either ask the fundamental question of what is the role of platforms like this in society,
Yes.
right? And then secondly, what's the business model associated with them? So to me, what you really want to do, my partner, Renee DeResta, who's a researcher in this area, talks about the issue of freedom of speech versus freedom of reach, the latter being the amplification mechanism. And so what's really going on these platforms is the fact that the algorithms find what people engage with and amplify that more. And sadly, hate speech, disinformation, conspiracy theories are, as I said, the catnip. That's what really gets the algorithms humming and gets people to react. And so in that context, eliminating that amplification is essential. And the question is, how are you going to go about doing that, and how are you going to essentially verify that it's been done? And in my mind, the simplest way to do that is to prevent the data from getting in there in the first place.
Yes. So the point is that I think you must go upstream to deal with it fundamentally in terms of the infrastructure. And I think some witnesses also mentioned that we need to look at education, which I totally agree with. But when it does happen, and when you have that proliferation of false information, there must be a downstream or an end result kind of reach. And that's where I think your example of Sri Lanka is very pertinent, because it shows and demonstrates that left unchecked, the platforms will do nothing about the false information that goes around. And what we do need is to have regulators and governments be clothed with powers and levers to intervene swiftly, and to disrupt the viral spread of online falsehoods very quickly. Would you agree?
As a generalization, I would not be in favor of the level of government intervention that I have recommended here. I simply don't see alternatives at the moment. That in order to do what Shoshana's talking about, in order to do what Jim is talking about, you have to have some leverage. And the only leverage governments have today is their ability to shut these things down.
Well, if you look
Nothing else works quickly enough.
Yes, exactly. So speed is crucial in that situation, because if you look at what's happened in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, recently in Jakarta, that's what's happened.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. My colleague will have some questions.
I have some follow-up questions with Mr. McNamee. I'd like to make reference to the Christchurch shooting on the 15th of March 2019. After that, the New York Times had actually published an article by Mr. Kevin Roos. I'd like to quote what he mentioned in his article. He said, "We do know that the design of internet platforms can create and reinforce extremist beliefs. Their recommendation algorithms often steer users towards edgier content, a loop that results in more time spent on the app and more advertising revenue for the company. Those were his words. So would Mr. McNamee agree that the design of internet platforms make it easier for extremist views to thrive and gain following?
Not only do I agree with that, I would like to make a really important point, which is that the design of the internet itself is part of the problem. That I'm of the generation, as Jim is as well, that were around when the internet was originally conceived and designed. And the notion in those days was that people could be trusted with anonymity. And that was a mistake, because bad actors use anonymity to do bad things. And the internet has essentially enabled disaffected people to find each other in a way they could never find each other in the real world, and to organize in ways they could not in the real world. So when we're looking at Christchurch, we have to recognize that the first step, this was a symphonic work. This man went in and organized at least 1,000 co-conspirators prior to the act, using the anonymous functions of the internet to gather them and prepare for this act. It was then and only then, after all that groundwork had been laid, that the amplification processes of the system went to work. But keep in mind, those same people kept reposting the film. It is still up there today.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
So,
We're past time, so if we have some time to get back around to finish your question, we will. Next up, we'll go up to the Republic of Germany for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to start with Jim Bassi. You mentioned in one of your 6 recommendations the question of taxation, and being a member of the Finance Committee myself, this is in many areas an important aspect. Can you go a little bit deeper? I mean, you mentioned especially the question of taxation of advertising. Do you see more areas there? And especially in the digital world, we know the problem of the shifting between countries and how difficult it is for countries to do a proper taxation.
Sure. And I'm talking about those that are buying the ads. And so really, you know, the core problem here is when you're ad-driven, you've heard extremely expert testimony that they'll do whatever it takes to get more eyeballs. And the subscription-based model is a much safer place to be because it's not attention-driven. And so the purpose of tax, one of the purposes of tax is to manage externalities. If you don't like the externalities that we're grappling with that are illuminated here, then disadvantage those. And many of these platforms are moving more towards subscription-based models anyway. So just use tax as a vehicle to do that. And the good benefit is it gives you revenue. The second thing it could do is also begin to shift towards more domestic services. So yeah, I think a tax has not been a lever that's been used, and it's right there for you.
All right. Thank you. And maybe one comment on accountability from our experience in Germany. We had, with the introduction of the so-called NetDG, our law, the aspect of accountability is one of the frequently mentioned aspects where the networks have a lot of headaches, because at that point it's really getting personal. And so I completely agree what you said. Professor Zuboff, I would like to ask you on what you mentioned, the support of new forms of citizen action. And I mean, being elected officials here, we know exactly how important it is to also convince the public, our voters, and also from our experience in Germany, many users have a lot of fears that something like Roger McNamee mentioned, that we shut down it. And I don't know exactly if we would earn a lot of praise for it, but we would have a lot of problems with our citizens. So how would you could we encourage the users, the citizens, that some steps like these are needed? And how can we avoid that it is perceived as some sort of censorship by governments? I mean, we are always in that area where government's interference also can be perceived as censorship.
Yes, and it's so critical to be conscious of that balance. You know, because obviously authoritarian governments, you know, would love Roger's recommendations. You know, we shut it down because we don't like what they're saying, and obviously that's not the intention here. So how do we make that distinction? I mean, one thing I can say to you is that I really think that we're in the midst of a sea change in this public reaction, and I wonder if you're seeing this in Germany. I've been traveling all over the world in many cities for the last 5 months continuously. And every group I talk to, I begin with one question. What are the concerns that brought you here? So all different parts of the world. And in every single group, no matter where I am, they say the same things. I ask them to shout out one word. And it begins with anxiety, manipulation, control, fear, resistance, democracy, freedom, rebellion, malaise, and the same constellation. And what I've learned is that that there is a sense within our populations that things are not right, that there is a power that is not aligned with our interests, that we don't understand it, and no one can control it. And that is beginning, you know, Cambridge Analytica, Chris Wiley, our work is all making a difference. So I think that there is a rightness there. And so we already, my advice would be look to those areas where these new crystallizations are already emerging. Barcelona is one, which is entirely based on citizen solidarity. There are other cities as well that are getting on that bandwagon. There are, you know, groups of digital workers who are trying to devise, you know, digital communities and digital sovereignty. So it's about amplifying these things that are already coming up from the grassroots. And then the other side, and Maria was, of course, mentioning this as well, education. We're still in a situation where every piece of Pew Research shows us over and over again, so many people simply do not understand these backstage operations. Why? Because billions of dollars have gone into designing them to keep us ignorant. So we've got to break that, and we've got to communicate and educate.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have the Republic of Chile. Go to next representative from Estonia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you very much for those inspiring presentations to kick off the morning. I will start with the question to Mr. McNamee, and my reading is and my understanding is that it is really difficult to force a toothpaste back to a tube once it's already got out. And I do think that the use of artificial intelligence algorithms, they are there to stay. And to be very fair, AI is not evil in itself or per se. So I would put my question this way, that if you were sitting in my chair today, what would be the 3 steps you would recommend or you would do if we leave those shutting down the platforms aside for a second?
The issue that we're dealing with here is that in the United States or in North America, roughly 70% of all the artificial intelligence professionals are working at Google, Facebook, Microsoft, or Amazon. And to a first approximation, they're all working on behavioral manipulation. There are at least 1 million great applications of artificial intelligence. Behavioral manipulation is not on them. I would argue that it's like creating time-release anthrax or cloning human babies. It's just a completely inappropriate and morally repugnant idea. And yet that is what these people are doing. And, you know, to Mr. Zimmerman's point, I would simply observe that it is the threat of shutting them down and the willingness to do it for brief periods of time that creates the leverage to do what I really want to do, which is to eliminate the business model of behavioral manipulation and data surveillance. And I don't think this is about putting toothpaste back into tubes. This is about formulating toothpaste that doesn't poison people. Okay? I believe this is directly analogous to what happened with the chemical industry in the 50s. The chemical industry used to pour its waste products, mercury, chromium, and things like that, directly into fresh water. They left mine tailings on the side of hills. Petrol stations would pour spent oil into sewers. And there was no consequences. So the chemical industry grew like crazy, had incredibly high margins. It was the internet platform industry of its era. And then one day society woke up and realized that those companies should be responsible for the externalities that they were creating. And that is what I'm talking about here. This is not about stopping progress. This is my world. This is what I do, okay? I just think we should stop hurting people. We should stop killing people in Myanmar. We should stop killing people in the Philippines. And we should stop destroying democracy everywhere else. We can do way better than that. And it's all about the business model. And I don't want to pretend I have all the solutions. What I know is the people in this room are part of the solution. And our job is to help you get there. So don't view anything I say as a fixed point. View this as something that we're going to work on together. And, you know, the three of us are happy to take bullets for all of you, okay? Because we recognize it's not easy to be a public servant with these issues out there. But do not forget, you're not going to be asking your constituents to give up the stuff they love. Okay? The stuff they love existed before this business model. It'll exist again after this business model.
Well, coming from a country where basically all the life is also digital, I very much agree that it doesn't mean to stop the progress. But I will continue now with Mr. Balzil and ask, you several times underlined the need to regulate the political micro-targeting or the political parties' ads. And yet I must bring the example from 2007 when Estonia was first time under a very massive, serious cyber attack. And the main targets of these attacks were not government sector, but it was mainly private sector. So as I see it, a lot of damage can be done targeting also anything but the political parties or party politics. Do you see that the regulations need to be different for political micro-targeting and all the other ads, or do you see that basically the rules are needed the same way in both sectors?
I agree with Roger that it needs to be in both sectors, but if there's one that's uniquely pernicious, it's the underpinnings of our democracy. So I think there needs to be complete transparency of all activities between political parties and these platforms, and I think that political parties should be under privacy legislation. Believe it or not, in Canada, our political parties are not governed by our privacy legislation, and I think that it requires a special kind of personalized ban during elections. But I do agree with Roger that the business model is fundamentally flawed. It's going to take a constellation of activities to get there. But I think the political place is the most sensitive and most targetable place to fix it right away.
And yet a lot of damage can be done by, I don't know, micro-targeting ads concerning the environmental damage, for example, or medicine, or several other sectors. But my last question would be actually coming.
We're actually at time. If we have time to get back around, we're already at 6 minutes, so we'll move on. I do think we'll have some time. We see some of the delegations haven't arrived yet, so we'll go next up to Mexico.
Thank you. I am going to speak in Spanish, if you allow me. Very well. In Mexico, very recently, well, our president has participated 3 times in elections, and every single time he was censored in the traditional media, to the point that, thanks to the social networks, we were able to communicate among citizens, and this enabled democratization, so there was greater participation in Mexico in recent times. However, we also have to face with another question that has to do with the bots, as we call them, that is to say robots, so that we can diffuse trends in Twitter, Facebook, and so on that are trying now to undermine our regime. So there are authors in Mexico that talk about the fourth generation war. That has to do with the diffusion in social networks. The last weekend we had a situation such as this one. One of the people that were part of the president's cabinet left his post. So in Twitter, we started seeing that the president would name and would appoint a corrupt person for the environment. So then what happened was that they started saying that the president was corrupt because he wanted to appoint someone who was corrupt. That was never the idea. Yesterday, he appointed another person, and even though this was made clear, nothing happened. So then how can we face this type of situation of democracy and anti-democracy that is favored on social networks? Because, of course, it allows people to participate, but we also see the generation of these trends. And there's another topic that has to do with what Maria Reza has suffered, this sexting issue. For a woman is something that has to do with the international sphere, because we've known of many cases where we go to all the instances, that is to say national entities. There's nothing to do because there is no legislation in the sense, but at the same time, this transcends borders. So what we have to do is go to Google, and Google becomes something of a tribunal, an international court. So it's very difficult to get rid of these images. And so we've seen suicides. We've seen people that have done terrible things because of this. So what can we do at an international level? How can we work together, men and women, for this to end once and for all? Thank you.
Do you have anybody specific to answer your question? Or just all the panel?
No, anyone who could.
Yeah, thank you. So go ahead, maybe with Ms. Zuboff. Go ahead.
Well, we're surfacing this theme over and over again. If you think about the history of science and engineering in the 20th century, the whole idea was that systems would be created to cure and to provide fail-safe for any problems. So in medicine, for example, the idea was vaccines that could counter viruses. And in engineering, it was backup systems, fail-safe systems, layers of systems that could counter crises when they occurred. Safety. It's extraordinary that the internet has been loosed upon the world to launch viruses without vaccines, to create channels for the kinds of things that you're describing, the robots, the disinformation, without any kind of fail-safe system. And as we've been discussing, this goes back to a fundamental problem, which is that there is no such thing as content moderation. There is only behavioral surplus supply chains and the idea of protecting these flows of behavioral data. So everything that the platforms do is down a very narrow line. The only action that emerges is if they're in danger of losing user engagement, of using surplus flows, or on the other hand, if they're in danger of attracting legal scrutiny. Other than that, there is no action that they are programmed to take, right? Because it is fundamentally an existential threat to do anything that limits behavioral surplus flows, the data flows. So that's where we have the opportunity, you have the opportunity to create those interventions when there are And I don't think it can be just a knee-jerk reaction to, you know, the problems that the president confronted at a certain moment. We have to think more systemically and go back to the root causes. Otherwise, we are in danger of falling into the problems that Mr. Zimmerman was referring to, which is that our governments, you know, are seen as self-serving. So we have to devise these sort of fundamental mechanisms that we insist upon, that there can be no virus without vaccine, that there have to be routine ways for lies to be stopped. And that is an existential threat to surveillance capitalism, and therefore we go back to the foundations here of addressing the economic logic, you know, and that's going to cover the sexual assault in the social network, as well as the political assaults in the social network. All of these are captured by the same economic contradiction.
Thank you very much. Next up, we'll go to Morocco for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me first of all thank you, organizers and co-organizers, for making of this meeting the event that it is today. I've been attentive, following the precious and valuable interventions, which were all trying to convey some ideas and thoughts regarding protection of personal data on the one hand, and the correlation between this protection and democracy, which is ultimately the core of the topic. Needless to remind you that violating private lives is shaking, if not jeopardizing, our democratic choices. That is, the detention of personal data by certain actors, be they state actors or trade actors, renders our democracies vulnerable and subject to manipulation. And today, whether we like it or not, ourselves, we all become nomophobic to the extent that this reminds me of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We become victims of our machines. And I've heard Shoshana speaking of the failure of legislators to devise laws and enforce frameworks. Galileo once said, "You cannot teach a man everything. You can only help him discover it within himself." And I guess this is what we need to grasp today more than ever before, beyond the restrictions, beyond the laws, and beyond the regulations. So don't you think, and this is my question is directed to Shoshana, that it's an ethical question? And nobody can legislate on ethics. But what is frightening today is the more it says, the more it's going to be hard to handle. So how would you react to that? Thank you.
This is such a wonderful question. I realized I didn't have time this morning to share this with you, but it's in my written statement. But there's a fascinating story here about a U.S. Senate subcommittee that was convened in 1971, chaired by a famous senator, Sam Ervin, who was one of the Watergate senators who defended democracy in that crisis. And it was a bipartisan committee, everyone from the arch conservative Strom Thurmond to Ted Kennedy. It was convened around the subject of behavioral modification, because behavioral modification had been imported from the Cold War into civil society and was now being used in schools and hospitals, in prisons, in all kinds of institutions of captive populations. And Sam Ervin wrote the conclusion for this committee. And he said that behavioral modification fundamentally undermines individual sovereignty. It robs people of autonomy. And without individual sovereignty and without autonomy, there can be no freedom. And without freedom, there can be no democracy. The outcome of 4 years of deliberation on that subcommittee was to eliminate all federal funding for behavioral modification programs. right? That was in the 1970s. I think of the 1970s as 5 minutes ago, right? Those were some of the best years of my life. It wasn't that long ago, right? So now they're talking about aiming this at these institutions, bounded organizations. Here we are, 2019, and we have global architectures of behavioral modification backed by trillions of dollars of capital. And where is the outrage? Where is the moral compass? Where is the response within us, as you say, that says this cannot stand? This is inimical to everything that our societies are founded on. And so I agree with you. Part of our challenge now is to get over the ideologies of the last 4 decades that have belittled government, that have belittled the state, that have denied regulation as an assault on freedom, to understand, as I said before, that these companies know too much to qualify for freedom. We need to only democracy. Survey everything on the horizon. Only democracy, which means only you, have the power and the capability and the tools to intervene on this process before it is too late. Just one tiny little comment about something that was said earlier. It won't be done in a year. I think you brought this up, Mr. Kent, the time frame. This kind of change, this kind of structural transformation, it is not the work of a day or a month or a year. But it can be done in 5 years. And maybe in 5 years, and certainly in the next decade, we have a horizon to shift the Titanic. We have the time and the capabilities to do that. What we need, as you've just said, we need to get in touch again with our moral bearings. They are there, and we should not be intimidated.
Thank you, Ms. Zuboff. Next up, we'll go to Costa Rica.
Muy buenos días. Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Voy a hablar en español porque me queda más como tal vez quería compartir dos ejercicios.
Just hold on a second. Translation isn't operating yet.
A ver, it's coming. It's coming. Is it coming? Thank you. Thank you, sir. I'm going to be speaking Spanish also. I feel more comfortable. I'd like to share with you 2 things we've been doing in Parliament in Costa Rica and also in the presidency of the Republic to take care of these effects. Recently, the president of the country spoke against a group of trolls that she was able to identify because they were disseminating fake news. As a result of this, we have created mechanisms of double-check truth hashtag trend about fake news. We have also created a hashtag to check the information that is broadcast mass. Hashtag let them not lie to you. It is rather a movement of checking the information on civil society who want to have actual truth. This has in a way softened things, but we have the debate indeed whether this implies limiting freedom of expression, the possibility of creating these rules. The social movement has had greater effect than the debate in Parliament. I wanted to share that since the president was the one who was speaking about it, this has been very important in order to disseminate the information.
Ms. Reza, for any comments? We haven't heard from you for a little while. Any comments?
No, well, I guess part of what we're still seeing here is the debate is centering on the gatekeeping part. Sorry, I'll look at it in the context of journalism. Standards and ethics, which are the values of it for content moderation in terms of what Shoshana said. And then in terms of gatekeeping, it is behavioral modification. Journalists have always had the ability to do that, but the reason we didn't before was precisely because we were held accountable for it, but there was still a self-regulating function. And I think to just do a very simple action, because what I'm worried about sometimes, even though we're under attack, is that this would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So it's a word that was mentioned by Shoshana, transparency. So transparency, accountability, and then consistency. I think this is creative destruction that we're seeing right now. And I think jumping to turning it all upside down without starting with pulling one thread may throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Thank you, Ms. Reza. We'll go up. The last country that's going to ask a question is St. Lucia. And we will have time for Singapore and Estonia to ask one more question each. So go ahead. St. Lucia.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I come from a country or a region where it was once said, or it's still being said, I suppose, that when the first world sneeze, we catch the cold. We never understood, or we never knew, we participated in Facebook and their platforms, but until the 2016 American election, we never knew what effect they were having on our own. And that's when we got to know about Cambridge Analytica and the other platforms' involvement in our own domestic elections. We being what I would put on the table as untouched territory, so to speak, what advice would you have for us in our region as to how do we protect ourselves moving forward? Because it seemed like almost what I would say the first world seemed to have now the plague. We do not want to catch it. So how would you suggest that we go about protecting ourselves?
Would you like to start?
Maybe I'll begin. I'll bookend it. One, I think you have a forum here where you're learning from each other, and it's too much to ask for each individual to learn by themselves. Plus, these companies are very sophisticated at playing you off one another. So I would encourage you to find a way to institutionalize your forum as something that others can join and preserves so that you can manifest best practices. So I think that will protect you on one end. I think one thing we haven't touched a little much on today is the very profound benefit we've had from whistleblowers that have really opened our eyes on these things, that we learn about bad activity through whistleblowers, both in the private sector and the public sector. And in the suite of things that you're going to do, make sure that whistleblower protection of both government and private sector is something you enshrine both individually and collectively.
I would just really want to add and underscore what Jim just said. There is an opportunity here, for a collectivity, and for this group to begin to identify some of the kinds of interventions and policy interventions and regulatory actions that you want to experiment with. And there may be different countries here, who become the living laboratory for some of these experiments, but you're not out there, doing it alone. You're doing it with your colleagues, and everyone is monitoring, and everyone is learning, and everyone is helping to fine-tune, and then everyone is involved in the migration of best practice, across the conversations that are taking place in each nation. So I really want to encourage you to pursue the question, but to do it in a way that helps build this institutional vision that Jim is describing, because that's what is going to move our shared societies forward.
Mr. Daniel, I think you have an enormous problem trying to solve this by yourselves. I think that Google doesn't believe that it's competing against Facebook. Facebook doesn't believe it's competing against Google. I think Google thinks it competes against the government of China, where the technology companies report to the government. And I think Google views itself as in competition at that level, and that countries are at best subsidiary to them. And I think they're unbelievably clever at playing countries off against each other, and they're very clever at essentially delaying long enough so that it becomes impossible to act. And the business model is the issue. It is pervasive, and for a smaller scale country, the degrees of freedom available to you are very, very limited. And again, I hate to keep coming back to the Sri Lanka example, but as far as I can tell, I don't care what scale your country's at. I think this is just as true of the United States. I don't think the United States has any leverage over these guys at all, short of shutting them down, or at least threatening to shut them down. And, you know, what we have to do is develop some leverage. And that is really what the challenge is for this committee and for policymakers around the world. You have to recognize that what you're dealing with here is something that's really big, it's really new, and they have absolutely no intention of cooperating. You have no leverage over them, none. And until somebody shows that they're serious about doing something about this, it's just going to keep going on.
Mr. McNamee. We'll go next to Singapore and then Estonia. So one last question each. Go ahead.
Mr. McNamee, in your book, you say that whether by design or by accident, platforms empower extreme views in a variety of ways. The ease with which like-minded extremists can find one another creates the illusion of legitimacy, and protected from real-world stigma, communication among extreme voices over internet platforms generally evolves to more dangerous language. So do you agree that by providing a place for extremist content to thrive and for like-minded people with extreme views together, that the tech companies bear some responsibility for grave attacks such as the Christchurch shooting?
The answer, I do believe that they bear responsibility. But again, to go back to the answer I gave you before, we have to also remember the things that are inherent in the architecture of the internet. And so to me, the question is, is there some way to put anonymity, on trial and have a conversation about whether identity is something that's fundamental? If you're going to have a right to free speech, do you have to be honest about who you are, right? Yes. I think this is a really difficult thing, and it's way above my talent level to answer that question. But what I think the companies are guilty of is the amplification. It is their design that amplifies hate speech. It is not their design that allowed those people to congregate. Yes. It is true that in other contexts, they do allow them to congregate. In that particular one, the congregation took place in things like 8chan and in Reddit, right? And so this is a super, super difficult problem. And sometimes you're going to see the getting together. I mean, obviously what the Russians did in the United States in 2016 took place inside Facebook, inside Instagram. And so yes, they do have responsibility. But again, I think these things are really hard to parse. And I look forward to working with you going forward, because I do not want to pretend like I've got a snap answer for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Estonia for the next question.
Yes, thank you. Well, disinformation campaigns have really been part of Estonia's big neighbors' wonderful methodology for ages. Russia's hybrid warfare, it's there already for a very long time. And I would say that everything that helps to destabilize or distract the societies will be used and have been used. So this is why I said before that even today, if we had already in place the regulations for political parties, for how they use the data, it would not solve all the problems. Yes, it would be necessary for sure. And Estonia has been one of the countries who has been a strong believer that the rules that apply offline also have to apply online. But it's not enough if we say that it's only the problem of political parties, because it is not. It's much more wider. But now my question would be actually about GDPR. Again, coming from Europe, we have had, after our own very intense debates, GDPR in effect now already for some time. And since the beginning of GDPR, we have actually got 95,000 data protection complaints to the national authorities, which a little bit shows the demand that is there. I would like your comment. How do you see the GDPR regulations when it comes to the protection of personal data?
If I may, I think GDPR is an excellent step forward. I think the control elements of personal data and the portability and the consent aspects, and I believe the shift to more algorithmic integrity is a great step forward. So I think that's really powerful. I think all the folks around this committee should reflect on the fact that I believe under Article 8 of the EU Constitution is that they've drafted GDPR that is a universal human right. So I, as a Canadian, can demand all my data controlled from Canada under EU law, or they're breaking European legislation. So I think how you can play these various jurisdictional regimes and structures is a very, very powerful set of possibility. And I think Europe is showing a model for the world, and I think it's a journey. I think Roger hit upon something extremely important, which is paying attention to the identity aspects. Traditionally, governments gave you credentialed identity called passports and driver's license, and I think that's been a gap in the internet and its design, and Tim Berners-Lee would say that perhaps governments should come back into that role of saying, we'll be looking after identity, and that's a form of vertical state investment that you could explore here and could address much of the problem at a very surgical level.
Add something about GDPR. I worry that the next step, you have to expand what it covers. You have to address not just the data that people put into these systems, but the data that is systematically gathered about them, you know, through acquisition from third parties, through surveillance tools like Alexa, and through web tracking. I mean, the fact that none of that is covered and is a huge issue. And then obviously you have to have a regulatory enforcement policy that puts teeth into it, because the fines are trivial and the processes take way too long, and none of that's having any impact. I mean, you can see that fines of billions of euros have no impact on these companies. It needs to be tens of billions of euros, and it needs to be every month, right? I mean, you have to get their attention. They're right now, all of this from their, I mean, right now, Facebook wants to move everything to the current version of GDPR because it prevents their competitors, right? The cost is so much higher on their competitors that it's an enormous advantage to them, and it doesn't touch any of the surveillance capital concepts that they're excited about. I mean, the stupidity of Facebook and Google was that they didn't embrace it right off the chute and actually implement it.
Thank you. That brings us to the conclusion of the questions. I'll just summarize with a few minutes of comments. Ms. Zuboff, you mentioned the term behavioral modification. Ms. Reza, you talked about creative destruction. And I guess, Mr. Balsillie, you talked about undermining our personal autonomy. And I think last night, because I had nothing better to do, I was watching CPAC and watching you, Mr. McNamee, on there, and you referred to our audience and our users as a particular name. And it's always our challenge as legislators is to relate to the millennial generation in terminology that we can all easily understand. And you mentioned the term voodoo dolls. So I just would like you to finish off by the explanation of what that is and how you explained it last night, because I really couldn't think of a better way to explain it, what's happening to our generation. Thank you.
When they gather all of this data, the purpose of it is to create a high-resolution avatar of each and every human being. Doesn't matter whether you use their systems or not. They collect it on absolutely everybody. And it is, you know, the concept in the Caribbean of voodoo was essentially this notion that you create a doll, an avatar, and that you can poke it with a pin, and the person would experience that pain, right? And so it becomes literally a representation of the human being. And so my partner Tristan Harris came up with this notion of the voodoo doll to describe what's going on here, because what happens is that before long, when you get to this point where you can anticipate what people are going to be able to do, because the resolution of the voodoo doll and the context of all the other voodoo dolls you have, you can see what people who have common characteristics have done, and it tells you what this person's going to do. And as Shoshana makes the core point, that at the beginning it's about trying to anticipate. But ultimately, the final analysis is about actually manipulating their behavior. And the way you do this is by controlling the menu. We as consumers think that Google is an honest broker, that Facebook is an honest broker, and that the results of our queries are honest, but they're not. They're informed by the data voodoo doll. And as a consequence, they're manipulating our behavior because they manipulate the choices that are available to us. And all of this, just as with a voodoo doll in the Caribbean, you're not aware of it. And you're just aware that the outcome has happened without understanding what the source of it is. And I just think that's wrong. And I think as policymakers and as somebody who spent 35 years in Silicon Valley, it's our job to come to the defense of our constituents.
Thank you, Mr. McNamee, and I just would like to thank you for all testifying. And again, with the offer that Ms. Zuboff made to us is to help us get there. I think we're going to be calling on you. This committee will end tomorrow at noon. Certainly, though, the work will not. And we look forward to having your opinions as a feedback loop, and also to ask you questions on a regular basis to get the answers that we're needing. So again, thank you for appearing today. Our time is very short, so a turnaround time, we're going to have the platforms appear at 10:30, so that's in 10 minutes. So thank you again for appearing before us today.